The winter of 1817 was not a season, it was a sentence. Northumberland lay buried beneath snow, so deep it hushed even the most gossiping tongues, and in that silence stood Ashbourne Hall, a fortress of stone and sorrow. Within its shuttered windows lived Edward Alaric Hawthorne, Duke of Ashbourne, a man spoken of in drawing rooms with both awe and pity. Once the golden heir of a noble line, he had returned from the Napoleonic Wars haunted and remote, his laughter lost somewhere on the battlefields of Spain. The village children called him the Winter Duke, for no warmth ever seemed to linger where he passed. Far below that marble world, in a humbler carriage creaking along the icy road, sat Miss Frances Whitby, 20 years of age and newly exiled from London splendor. Once the darling of her late mother's soirees, she now carried the tarnish of disgrace upon her slender shoulders. Her father, Baron Whitby, had gambled and lost much of the family's estate on a failed investment in shipping. Bankruptcy had not only emptied their coffers but scattered their allies. A daughter without dowry was an inconvenient truth no London hostess wished to recall. So, under the pretext of convalescence, Frances had been sent north to the care of distant relatives, where the air was pure, the silence unbroken, and prospects non-existent. Her arrival coincided with a gathering at the neighboring estate, where the local gentry assembled for music and cards. It was there, beneath chandeliers that trembled from the draught of an ill-fitted window, that she first beheld the Duke of Ashbourne. He stood apart from the room, tall and solemn in black, one gloved hand resting upon a silver-topped cane. Conversation around him fell into hushed reverence. His expression was unreadable, like a portrait half-shaded by candlelight. Frances, caught between curiosity and pity, felt an inexplicable ache at the sight of him, a man so fiercely alone among so many who sought his notice. The hostess, a matron determined to forge acquaintances, insisted upon an introduction. Frances curtsied gracefully, her voice gentle as she spoke. "Your Grace, it is said the snows of Ashbourne are the most treacherous in all of England, and yet they seem to bow to you." A small pleasantry, no more daring than a compliment upon the weather. Yet the Duke's eyes, a cold gray sharpened by habit, met hers as though she had trespassed upon sacred ground. "Do not mistake obedience for peace, Miss Whitby," he replied, his tone measured, the air about him glacial. "Snow covers decay. It does not cure it." A murmur rippled among the listeners. Frances felt her pulse quicken but persisted, hoping to mend the awkwardness she had unwittingly stirred. "Then perhaps you prefer the thaw, Your Grace. The world is kinder when it softens." The faintest tightening of his jaw followed. Kindness is a word too easily spoken by those who have never seen its failure. "Spare me your philosophies. I am content with frost. It offends less than false hope." Laughter, polite and poisonous, whispered at the edges of the room. Frances's cheeks flushed crimson. She drew herself up, her dignity trembling but intact. "Then I shall not offend you further," she said quietly, and turned to depart. It should have ended there, in mere embarrassment. But the Duke's voice, low and cutting, carried through the hall before she could take another step. "Do not touch me. You'll never be my Duchess." The music faltered. A hush fell so heavy that the fire's crackle became a thunderclap. Frances felt the weight of 100 eyes upon her, some gleeful, some pitying. She lowered her head, managed a curtsy so steady it belied her shaking hands, and walked from the room with all the composure her pride could muster. Outside, snow began to fall anew, silent and merciless. Her breath came in shallow bursts, clouding before her face like ghosts of words unsaid. She told herself she did not care, that the Duke was a wretched man hollowed by arrogance. Yet beneath her anger stirred something deeper, a sting that no insult could fully explain. His words had struck not her vanity, but her loneliness, echoing the quiet fear that she would indeed never belong anywhere again. From a window above, the Duke watched her carriage depart. His reflection in the glass looked every bit the ghost he felt himself to be. For a moment, a fleeting, unwanted moment, He regretted the cruelty of his tone, but habit and guilt were stubborn masters. He turned from the window and into the darkness of his study, where a single candle burned beside an unopened letter sealed in black. The handwriting was his late brother's. He could not bear to read it. Down the winding road, Frances's carriage rattled through the whitening landscape, its lanterns swaying like fading stars. Inside, she sat rigid, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. Pride kept her tears unshed. Yet as the wheels cut through drifts of snow, she whispered to herself, "Let him have his solitude. I will have my peace." But peace, as the night would prove, was not yet hers to claim. The storm strengthened, wind howling like some ancient sorrow awakened. Miles of frozen moorland lay ahead, each flake of snow erasing the path behind her. Frances looked out at the blinding white, and, for the first time, felt a chill not of the body but of the spirit, a foreboding sense that fate, like the weather, had turned its gaze upon her. And somewhere within the looming silhouette of Ashbourne Hall, the Duke, who believed himself beyond redemption, had already taken the first unknowing step toward it. The night swallowed the last glimmer of her carriage lights. The snow fell heavier still, and though neither of them could have guessed it, the storm that raged outside would soon force their paths to cross again. This time with hearts, not words, at stake that BY morning. The storm had thickened into a white abyss. Carriages lay abandoned on the roads, their tracks swiftly swallowed by snow. Frances's had fared no better. Half buried in a drift near the Ashbourne border, its wheels splintered, it leaned helplessly on one side. The driver, after struggling against the wind, declared the horses could go no farther. There was only one refuge within reach, the Duke's estate, a mile through blinding frost. Frances hesitated. Pride urged her to wait, to find any other shelter, but the cold was merciless. Dignity, she told herself, was of little use to a corpse. With her cloak drawn tight and her boots sinking deep into the snow, she set her course toward the house of the man who had humiliated her. Ashbourne Hall emerged like a phantom from the white haze, its great iron gates frosted over, the stone facade grim and silent. The butler who opened the door blinked in disbelief at the sight of her, his face paling at the name she gave. Yet he ushered her in at once, unwilling to turn away any living soul in such weather. She was led to the drawing room, where the hearth's embers glowed faintly. The Duke appeared moments later, tall and austere, his dark coat dusted with snow. His expression betrayed no surprise, only that cold civility which seemed his armor against every human emotion. "Miss Whitby," he said, voice even, as though addressing a minor inconvenience. "It appears fate delights in irony." "Fate," she replied, shaking the snow from her skirts, "has poor manners." A pause, weighted and brittle. He inclined his head slightly. "You are welcome to shelter here until the roads are cleared. My servants will see to your comfort." The words were correct, impeccable, yet impersonal. He made to leave, but something in her posture caught his eye, the faint tremor of exhaustion she could not quite suppress. "You are chilled," he said curtly. "Have tea brought." It was less an offer than an order to his staff, but still, the gesture flickered like a weak flame against the cold between them. Days passed, and the snow showed no mercy. The house became a gilded cage. Frances, confined by propriety and weather alike, kept mostly to her chamber or the library, a cavernous room lined with the relics of generations. There she found traces of the man beneath the Duke, the arrangement of his books by theme rather than title, the letters tucked into volumes of history, and one worn copy of Paradise lost with notes in a delicate, feminine hand. The late Duchess, she surmised. The margins spoke of tenderness, of shared thought. Frances closed the book with quiet reverence, sensing the ghosts that still lingered in these halls. On the third day, she encountered him there. He stood by the window, the morning light falling cold upon his features. "You read Milton?" he asked, not turning. "I do," she answered carefully, "though I confess I prefer Hope to Exile." His lips twitched, almost a smile. "Then you must find most of life disappointing." "I find it survivable," she said softly, "and that, your grace, is often enough." He turned in, truly looking at her for the first time. The distance in his eyes faltered, replaced by something uncertain. Yet the moment dissolved as footsteps sounded in the corridor. The world of manners reclaimed them both. Later that week, another storm brewed, this one of whispers. During breakfast, a visiting cousin remarked on the impropriety of an unmarried woman under the Duke's roof. The servants, eager for mischief, had embellished the tale. A pair of gloves found in his study, said to belong to her. Frances's hand stilled upon her teacup. She understood instantly. Her gloves had indeed gone missing 2 nights before. She looked to the Duke, expecting his defense, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed on his plate. The humiliation cut deeper than the first. When she rose from the table, every eye followed. She left the room without a word, her composure brittle as glass. In her chamber, anger gave way to hurt. She resolved to request a carriage at the first sign of passable weather, even if it meant perishing halfway to town. She could not endure another day of such disdain. That evening, a knock sounded at her door. No servant entered. Only an envelope slipped quietly beneath. Her name was written in a firm, deliberate hand. Inside lay her gloves, carefully mended, along with a single line on thick paper. "The world is cruel enough, Miss Whitby. Let's not add to its sport." For several minutes, she sat motionless, staring at the note as if it might vanish. The words were not an apology, not quite, but they bore a humanity absent from his voice. She tucked the note inside her book and said nothing to anyone. Yet when she passed him in the corridor the next morning, something indefinable had shifted. He met her eyes briefly, then looked away, as though uncertain what new balance had been struck between them. Snow continued to fall, relentless and pure, cloaking the estate in isolation. The Duke's mood grew heavier with each passing day. Servants whispered of debts, of letters arriving under seal. Frances, though too polite to ask, noticed the strain etched into his face, the way he lingered over papers in the firelight, the sudden absences from meals. One evening she overheard 2 footmen speak of creditors threatening to claim portions of the land. She ought to have felt nothing but satisfaction at his misfortune. Instead, a strange compassion stirred. For all his hauteur, she saw now a man besieged by grief, by circumstance, perhaps by his own regret. He had built his solitude as defense, not disdain. That night, while the wind howled across the moors, Frances stood at her window and watched the snow whirl like pale ashes. She thought of the Duke alone in his study, of the note that had softened her bitterness, of how quickly life's fortunes could collapse. Somewhere in her heart, unbidden and unwanted, a resolve began to take form, a quiet wish to understand him, perhaps even to help. The fire in her chamber sputtered low, but she did not notice. Outside, the storm grew louder, battering the walls of Ashbourne Hall. Inside, another storm was gathering, one neither could yet name, but both, in their solitude, had already begun to feel. The snow did not cease, but by January's end, the drifts had hardened to glittering marble, and the world outside seemed carved from silence. Within Ashbourne Hall, however, the stillness had begun to tremble. The Duke moved through his days with a growing restlessness, each hour spent in council with stewards or poring over ledgers that whispered of ruin. Frances observed it from the periphery, never intruding, yet ever aware. His steps were heavier now, his voice quieter, his presence tinged with the weariness of a man standing at the edge of his own undoing. She found him one morning in the library, surrounded by papers. The fire had gone low, and his ink-stained fingers rested upon a letter he had not finished. He looked up as she entered, his expression shadowed, but not unkind. "You should not wander the halls so early, Miss Whitby. They are colder than the moors themselves." "I have grown used to cold," she said, seating herself near the hearth. "It behaves predictably, unlike people." That earned a faint sound from him, half a sigh, half amusement. "Then you have met too many of the wrong sort, or too few of the right." Her words lingered, soft, as the falling ash. He said nothing more, but when he resumed his work, the tension in his posture eased. Frances glanced at the scattered pages and saw the heading of one document: Creditors' Meeting, January 12th. Her heart tightened. It was not curiosity that made her linger, but concern. He had been a man of immense pride. To see him cornered by misfortune stirred a compassion she could no longer deny. That evening, while the household prepared for the upcoming 12th night ball, a last effort, she learned, to impress his lenders and restore his reputation, Frances stood in her room and weighed the courage of her own heart. The thought of leaving Ashbourne, once the roads cleared, filled her with unexpected dread. Somewhere in the days of snow and silence, she had grown attached to the place, to its quiet melancholy, and to the man who had once wounded her with words sharper than frost. Pride had melted into sympathy, and sympathy into something warmer, more dangerous. The night before the ball, Frances passed the Duke's study and heard the faint scrape of a chair, the weary sigh of a man alone. Without thought, she knocked. His enter sounded distracted, and when she stepped inside, he looked almost startled to see her. She hesitated at the threshold, unsure what propriety allowed. "I wished only to return this," she said, holding the book she had borrowed, Paradise Lost, its edges newly bound. It was torn. I took the liberty of mending it. He took the volume from her, his gaze unreadable. "That was my wife's," he said at last. "I thought never to see it whole again." "She must have loved the verse," Frances said softly. "The margins are filled with her thoughts." He nodded once, the movement restrained. She did. She believed beauty survived even in loss. "I confess I never shared her faith." "Perhaps you have not looked long enough," she replied. His eyes lifted to hers, cool, uncertain, searching. "You speak as though you know me, Miss Whitby." "You do not." "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I wish to." Silence settled, fragile and electric. The fire cracked between them, throwing amber light across his features, softening the hard lines carved by grief. For a heartbeat, the world held still. He took a step forward, stopped himself, then turned away sharply, as if afraid of what might follow. "You should go," he said quietly. "This house devours those who linger in it. Ask anyone who remembers." "I do not frighten easily, Your Grace." "Then you are a fool." "Perhaps," she admitted, her lips trembling into the faintest smile, "but a persistent one." He exhaled, half in defeat, half in something that might have been admiration. When she left, he remained standing, hand resting upon the mended book, the ghost of warmth lingering in the room long after her footsteps faded. The following day, the household stirred to feverish preparation. Candles were polished, silverware gleamed, and every servant carried a secret hope that the Duke's fortune might yet be saved. Frances watched the flurry of activity with quiet determination. She had overheard enough of the staff's whispers to piece together the truth. The creditors would attend the ball, not as guests, but as judges. If they withdrew their support, Ashbourne Hall would crumble. That afternoon, she slipped into the study once more, penning a letter of her own. Her father's former associates, men who owed him debts of gratitude even in ruin, might yet honor his name. If she could persuade them to invest in the Duke's estate, it might buy him the reprieve he needed. She sealed the letter quickly, praying it would reach them in time. Her signature trembled, not from fear of exposure, but from the knowledge that this act, if discovered, could destroy her reputation entirely. Yet what was reputation to a woman already forgotten by society? When evening came, the hall bloomed with light and music. The guests arrived in gleaming carriages, their laughter echoing through corridors that had long known only silence. Frances, dressed in modest silk the color of winter roses, moved among them like a secret. The Duke, resplendent yet remote, greeted his guests with the practiced elegance of a man hosting his own execution. Their eyes met only once across the room, but in that single glance, 1,000 unspoken things passed. Near midnight, she slipped away to the corridor overlooking the ballroom. From there, she watched him dance once, briefly, with a visiting countess. His expression was polite, detached, but when his gaze flickered upward, he found her watching. For an instant, his composure faltered. The Countess spoke. He did not hear her. Frances turned away, her heart caught between triumph and terror. Below, the music swelled. The creditors gathered in quiet corners. The letter she had sent 2 days earlier must have arrived by now. Tomorrow, she would know if her boldness had saved him or condemned them both. But tonight, as snow began to fall again beyond the tall windows, she allowed herself one dangerous thought, that perhaps hearts, like estates, could be redeemed by a single reckless act of faith. The 12th night ball began in splendor and deceit. Beneath chandeliers that glittered like captured stars, the guests of Ashbourne Hall performed their familiar rituals, smiles sharpened with envy, laughter perfumed with suspicion. Music swelled through the vast ballroom, drowning the undercurrent of gossip that threaded between waltzes. The Duke of Ashbourne stood at the center of it all, every inch the nobleman, immaculate, composed, but hollow. His debts, his solitude, his haunted pride, all hidden beneath the gleam of his signet ring. None could see how near his ruin lay. None, save the young woman who had once sworn never to think of him again. Frances entered the ballroom later than most, her gown of ivory silk modest yet luminous, a quiet defiance amid the jeweled glitter of the aristocracy. Her eyes found him at once. The Duke turned, drawn by some instinct deeper than will, and for a brief heartbeat the noise around them faded. She curtsied. He inclined his head, but neither spoke. Too many watched. The evening unfolded like a play they had not rehearsed. She moved among the guests, exchanging polite conversation, her composure flawless. He greeted his creditors with cold courtesy, concealing the desperation in every measured word. All the while, the secret she carried, the letter she had sent, the negotiations it set in motion, burned beneath her calm exterior. Her act had been reckless, perhaps unforgivable, yet she could not regret it. The estate might yet be saved, and with it, the man who had forgotten how to hope. As the hour grew late, the Duke's steward entered quietly, handing him a folded note. He broke the seal, read the brief lines, and froze. The creditors had accepted new terms, an arrangement secured through the influence and credit of Miss Frances Whitby. He stared at the page until the words blurred, his breath shallow with disbelief. The ballroom spun around him in a whirl of color and sound. He sought her immediately, but she stood across the room, unaware of the revelation her courage had wrought. When at last he reached her, the musician struck a softer tune. He stopped before her, his expression unreadable, his voice low. "Miss Whitby, might I have a word?" A hush rippled outward. The Duke of Ashbourne rarely asked, he commanded. Frances inclined her head and followed him through the tall doors into the adjoining gallery, where the candlelight flickered across marble busts and portraits of forgotten ancestors. The air between them was taut as a drawn bow. "Was it you?" he asked, his tone controlled, yet trembling with something fierce beneath. "I do not understand. Do not lie to me." His hand clenched around the note. "This agreement, this miracle, bears your name. What have you done?" She met his gaze steadily. "What you cannot. I appealed to those who once respected my father, and through them, your creditors were persuaded. Your estate is safe, your grace." He stared at her, half in fury, half in awe. "Safe? At what cost to you?" "At none that matters. You have endangered your name, your reputation, everything a woman possesses in this pitiless society. And for me? For justice, she said quietly. For decency. For the man who once told me I would never be his Duchess, yet who I knew was more honorable than his own despair." He turned away, running a hand through his hair, as though trying to steady a life that had tilted on its axis. "Do you realize what you've done? You have made me a debtor not to men, but to you. Then repay me," she whispered, "by living better than your grief." Her voice trembled, but did not break. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the fire crackling in the distant ballroom. The Duke faced her again, his expression stripped of hauteur, raw with something long dormant. "When I said those words to you," he murmured, "I thought them armor. I see now they were cowardice. He stepped closer, his gaze fixed upon her. You have undone me, Miss Whitby, not through scandal or beauty, but through mercy. And I cannot hate you for it. The doors behind them opened suddenly. The steward entered breathless. Your Grace, the creditors demand to see you. The guests they know. Frances drew back. Then go. Let them know you are not defeated. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her bearing, and something in him shifted. If I go, he said, I go as I am. No masks. And before she could reply, he turned and strode back into the ballroom. The murmurs swelled as he appeared, the music faltering into silence. All eyes followed him as he crossed the marble floor toward Frances, who had not moved from the gallery's threshold. The Duke stopped before her, his voice resonant enough to command every corner of the room. Enough, he said. If there's gossip, let it end now. Miss Whitby has done what no gentleman among you had the courage to do. She has saved Ashbourne, and in doing so, restored my faith and honor. If this offends you, then I am content to be offended. Gasps rippled through the assembly. The Duke turned to her fully, the rigid control of his demeanor melting at last. You have my estate, my gratitude, my soul. Will you take also my name? The room seemed to vanish around them. Frances stood motionless, the color draining from her face. Your Grace, she whispered, do not. He dropped to one knee. I once swore no woman would ever touch me again, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Yet here I stand, praying that you will. A tremor passed through the crowd. Even the musicians seemed unable to breathe. Frances's eyes filled with tears. Slowly, she extended her hand. Then rise, Edward, she said softly, and do not ask again, for I cannot say no. The hall erupted in applause that sounded like thunder breaking through centuries of frost. The Duke rose, taking her hand, and for the first time in years, smiled without restraint. Outside, snow still fell, but gently now, drifting like a benediction upon the old estate. As the windows fogged with warmth and laughter returned to Ashbourne, the storm that had bound them both at last began to fade. And though winter would linger a while longer over Northumberland, it was no longer a season of punishment, but of promise, the quiet thaw of two hearts that had dared, against every rule of pride and society, to find one another in the snow.